So some of the last protocols that we're just going to briefly go over is some protocols used for sharing and transmitting files. So some of the protocols that we'll be talking about is HTTP and HTTPS. We'll also talk about FTP, TFTP, SFTP, and FTPS. We'll briefly cover NFS and SMB/CIFS, CIFS / server message block. So let's get started. Okay, I'm actually including HTTP and HTTPS first up because if you think about it, that's exactly what we're doing when we go to a browser, is that page is being sent to my computer. So it's sharing an HTML file to my computer and then presenting it as a web page. So I included HTTP and HTTPS as an example of file sharing. So maybe stretching it a little bit there. But the other thing that I want to drive home too is there are a lot of web services out there. There's a lot of services that actually do file sharing. So whether it's Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive or Dropbox, there's a lot of services out there that share files and they use HTTP and HTTPS as a way to transmit that file and share those files. Okay, next up we have File Transfer Protocol. Not near as common as HTTP and HTTPS, but File Transfer Protocol is something that we use to share data and set it up. So I use this a lot when it comes to things like if you've got one system that needs to upload data into another system, then you'll upload it to an FTP server and then get it transferred to that server to get it into the system, into the other system. So I do this a lot of times when you're like transferring data from one system to another. Or another thing is like, let's say you have a website that you're getting up and going, then perhaps what you do to get the files, the HTML files up to the directories that it needs to get into is you use FTP to upload that data. And what it will do is it will make a connection and establish a TCP connection on port 21, but it'll actually use port 20 to do the file transfer and get things uploaded via port 20. So 21 is more of the control versus 20 is the stream of data that's happening. So FTP, File Transfer Protocol. Getting back to our URI discussion, you'll see that we're using a protocol FTP. We can send a username and password with this as we're sending it over, although I wouldn't recommend it because, well, just FTP in general is not secure. So we're going to talk about some ways that we can secure it, but I typically don't put the password in the transfer. Then we see that it's the domain is next. So we've got the domain that we're trying to connect to, and then the port that it exists on. So what port we're connecting to, usually it's port 21, and then the path of whatever directory we're trying to access on the other side. So that way we can upload files directly to that directory. So this is the syntax for connecting to a FTP server. There are some variations to it, such as TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. There is SFTP, which is SSH FTP. So essentially it's FTP, but it uses SSH to transfer those files. And FTPS. So FTPS is FTP secure or FTP over SSL, although once again, we really don't use SSL. It's not considered secure anymore, so we use other protocols such as TLS, but we have FTPS. I'd say I don't see this one all that often. I've only used TFTP when I'm doing some admin stuff, and I've got certain servers or Cisco equipment that need to use TFTP. This is the one that is most common, that I use the most, way beyond FTP. I try not to use, once again, FTP because it's just insecure. So we should try to avoid using FTP and opt for a more secure method. So now we have network file system. NFS is more associated with things like Linux, and it's a way to share out files and directories with NFS. So where I've most commonly used this is for things like virtualization, where I have some sort of NAS storage and I can use NFS to share out volumes to my infrastructure, so that way I can share out different volumes and then different servers can have access to those volumes and it can store virtual machines on it. So it's pretty powerful. There's a lot of cool features in NFS, and it's used more on, like I say, Linux machines, and I've used it with things like virtualization. Although if you're more on Windows and use Windows more, then you're probably going to gravitate away from NFS and use more SMB or CIFS. SMB is server message block. CIFS is actually an older version, or one of the versions of SMB. So really, you may see CIFS out there, reference CIFS, but really it's server message block that is used nowadays. It's a way for Windows machines, not always Windows machines, but Windows machines to share out things like files and folders or printers or other objects. And so SMB is a way to share out the resources on a Windows network. Now, if this happened to be something like a Linux box and you wanted to share to Windows machines, then you could set up a service like Samba and set up Samba to share out files and folders on it. I really like SMB because it's got a lot of permissions and a lot of granularity when it comes to controlling access. So I really love how much control it gives you on access to these different files and resources. So, but that's SMB or CIFS. All right, that was a real quick video on sharing and transmitting files. We talked about transmitting files and how HTTP and HTTPS is probably the most popular way of transmitting files out on the internet, at least. We also talked about FTP, TFTP, SFTP, and FTPS. Mainly what's used out there that I've seen is FTPS. And then we talked about NFS and how it's used generally more with on your local network with Linux machines versus on local networks with Windows machines. Then you're talking more like SMB/CIFS. So thanks for joining me. This has been about sharing and transmitting files. I hope these videos are really helping you out. If they are, I'd really appreciate you hitting that like button.